Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Kuf Mem Zayin. Today's daf is sponsored by Esther Kramer in loving memory of Manny Gross on his second yurtzeit. May his memory forever be a blessing. Today's daf is sponsored by Mark and Debbie Pershan in loving memory of Mark's mother, Perel Bela Bat Simcha, on the occasion of her shloshim. Okay, we're going to get started with a quick review of where we started yesterday at the Mishnah, and there's a study guide today which will be helpful. You can use it. Also, I started from the Mishnah in the study guide to kind of summarize what we got up to until now. So if you want to follow along in the study guide, the review, you can do that. We started with this Mishnah that distinguished between a shchiv meira, a person on their deathbed who gives away all of their possessions, and someone who gives away not all of their possessions, even retaining just a small part of their property. Changes everything, because that shows, it's an indicator that at least we can make an assumption, and that's the whole thing of the Gemara, that this is all just making assumptions, that this person did not give them away because they were planning to die, because that's why they left some for themselves. They thought they weren't necessarily going to die. And therefore, the gift is valid even if the person gets better. Whereas if they gave away all of their possessions, we can assume a person wouldn't give away all their possessions unless they were really thought they were going to die. Otherwise, what are you going to live on? And therefore, we assume if the person gets better, they never meant to give away any of it and they get all of it back. That's the big distinction to which the Gemara wants to know. Who is the person who's the Tana who holds that we go by this umdina, and we bring, Rav Nachman brought a bright of Rav Shimon ben Menasya, and Rav Shesha brought a bright of Rav Shimon Shazuri. It's a little confusing because they're both Shimons. The Mishnah that with Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, actually, we said that according to most of the commentators, it's really all the opinions there, which was this issue of someone who's about to get killed and says, kitvu, okay, or they're worried they're going to die, or, right, we don't know for whatever reason. And they say, kitvu get lishi, we assume they mean kitvu v'tnu. And Rav Nachman case about Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya was someone who their son went abroad and they heard rumors that the son was dead, and then they wrote all their property to somebody else. And then we assume that when they find out the kid was alive, that whatever they wrote to somebody else was not really meant for them. It was only because they thought their son was no longer alive. So those are the two different opinions. And then we finished with why didn't each one hold by the other? Okay. And why they each thought that the other case maybe would be different from our Mishnah for whatever reason. Okay. We're not going to go over all of that. But now we're going to start with the question at the bottom of Kuf Mem Vav Amud Bet. Now they're going to quote a different Braita, and they're going to say, who is the author of this Braita? Man Tana Lahaditanu Rabbanan, and you'll see they have a bit of an agenda here. There was a sick person who was in bed. And they said, right, they were worried he was going to die. And they said, who are you giving your property to? And he said to them the following, okay, which is hard to understand exactly what this person means, but kind of like, I thought I had a son, maybe he had a son, but the son, now here the son was dead, or something like that. Now I find out I don't really have a son, or maybe he thought someone was his son and it turns out his wife had a child with somebody else. I don't know. But he said, I thought I had a son. Now that I don't have a son, I'm writing my property to somebody else. Case number 2. We haven't yet heard the continuation of case number 1, but we're going to have the beginning of case number 1, the beginning of case number 2, then the end of both cases. Another case where someone's sick in bed and they say, who do you want to give your property to? It seems to me like my wife is pregnant. But now that I find out that my wife isn't pregnant as I thought she was, maybe she miscarried, right? Now I find out she's not really pregnant, or, she thought she was pregnant. Turns out she really isn't. I'm giving my possessions to someone else. But then, so that's the part 1 of each of the cases. Right? The obvious what happens here, otherwise there wouldn't really be a case, is otherwise it would be simple. The nechasai go to somebody else. But what happened here, he finds out he does have a son, or he finds out his wife was actually pregnant. Ein matana to matana. So the matana is canceled. So this again sounds like an umdana, because had he known he had a son, he never would have done this. And it sounds like the case from before. To which they say, Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, Rabbanan. Are we going to suggest that this follows Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya's position, who, again, if you didn't remember, is a very similar case. The son goes abroad, he hears a rumor the son's dead, and then decides to write his property to somebody else. Sounds like the same case, right? It's the same premise. thought he had a son. Turns out he didn't, right? Thought he had a son, then he didn't have a son, then he wrote his property to somebody else, and then it turns out he did have a son. So the Gemara now says, no, they're not really the same. Afilu tema Rabbanan, domeh shani. This case is different because what did the person say? The person said, domeh sheyesh li ben. In the case that Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe was talking about, he didn't even mention the fact that he thought he had a son. He just heard his son died and decided to write his possessions to somebody else. But it wasn't as clear a connection when the man wrote the property to somebody else. He didn't say, because my son died, right? Whereas here, he kind of said, because my son's not there, right? I thought I had a son, I don't. So because he expressed it, domeh is a reference to the first word on our daf, domeh sheyesh li ben, to those words, where it sounded like he was saying, seems that, I thought I had a son, and now it turns out I didn't. So now the Gemara says, why did you even think to compare these cases? And the way the Gemara always asks that question is kind of funny words. Ude karila, my karila. When you said it in the beginning, when you called the comparison, what on earth were you thinking? Why did you think these cases were comparable? It's obvious that this case is different. To which the Gemara answers, Mao de tema, stare hu de kamidkar. Maybe just he's sitting there on his deathbed, feeling just remorse that he doesn't, sad that he doesn't have any children. And he's just saying, wow, I'm at the end of my life. I don't have a son to inherit me. And just sort of saying, I'm sad that I don't have a son. But not necessarily that it's connected to, and that's why I'm giving my property to somebody else. But just kind of stating, I'm sad I don't have a son to pass on my inheritance to. You could say that's sort of the same, but it's not the same as I thought I had a son that was going to inherit my property and now I don't, and therefore I'm giving it to so-and-so. That's much more direct. But you could have read it, again, a ma'u de tema is a suggestion. What you might have thought, sari hu de kamidkar, it's just mentioning how sad it is that I don't have a child to pass on my inheritance to. And then says, okay, I'm giving it to somebody else. Kamash malan, no, it comes to teach you, right? What the Gemara is trying to tell you here is, don't think that. This really holds by everybody, right? And even the rabbis would agree in this case that it's very clear that it's because he thought he didn't have a son and therefore wrote it to somebody else. And therefore, everyone would agree, even the rabbis in this case, it's not even an umdana, it's very clear cut. Now we're going to move on to another sugya, which is connected, but what we're going to try to do for almost the entire daf, with a huge digression in the middle to a sugya we've seen before about the winds and the weather and all that. So for those of you who it's raining by you, it was raining by me earlier today. I think it might have stopped now, but when I taught the Hebrew daf, it was pouring rain with the winds going, and I thought, oh, this is great. This is exactly what we're learning. But anyway, we're going to get off on a big tangent of that. But the real sugya that we want to deal with right now is, I'll read the first words here, but Amar Rabbi Zera Amar Rav, Minayin lamatnat shchiv meirah shehi min Torah. So he starts off with this question: how do we know that a shchiv meirah is from the Torah? Now, what about a shchiv meirah is from the Torah? A person on his deathbed. What we mean is what we keep talking about, which is when a person on their deathbed says, "I want my property to go to so and so," even though the Mishnah was talking about if the person lives, it's all undone. But that implies, though, if the person dies, whatever the person said is a done deal. Matanato matana. Okay, whatever that person designated, this is going to this person, this is going to that person, even without the big chidush, even without a kinyan. No act of acquiring, no nothing. Just the words of a shchiv meirah, as we say many times, and again, we haven't seen this yet in the Gemara, we'll see it in a few dapim. Divrei shchiv meirah kechtuvim uchim mesurim dami. Okay, if you're going to learn one thing from the end, or the second part of this Masechet, it's those words. The words of a shchiv meirah, okay, you should know this in your sleep, are like they're written, kichtuvim, umisurim, and handed over. Remember, Masira, the act of Masira is an act of kinyan. So it's as if it's written in a document and handed over. It's a really done deal. So now we want to know what's the source for this in the Torah. And we're going to have 4 answers, which are going to turn into 5. Why do I say 4? They're going to turn into 5. Well, we're going to have 4, then we're going to have that big break. Then we're going to go to the 5th. But the 5th one really is a standalone because the Gemara starts off, or not really the Gemara, that's the thing. It's not the Gemara asking, but Rabbi Zera starts asking the question, where do we get it from the Torah? But the 5th answer is going to be, and if I asked you what the reason is, you probably know it already because we've discussed this, which is actually the fifth answer, which is it's not actually from the Torah, it's a takana of the rabbi. But before we get there, we're going to see four sources in the Torah, which aren't really all in the Torah, two in the Torah, two in the prophets. So let's get started. So we already asked the question, and now we're going to see this was all Rav Zera in the name of Rav. So here's Rav's answer. Shene'emal v'ha'avartem et nachalato lebito. This is a pasuk we've darshan many times, and you might say, what do you mean? You can't learn more than one thing from one word. Well, that's one of the reasons why they're going to say later, why didn't the second opinion hold by this? Because this pasuk is needed for something else. But he thinks we can learn it from this pasuk. Says, if there's no sons, you pass on the inheritance to the daughters. Now, in all the other places where it says, if there's no this, then you give it to the others. But only by the daughter, it says, v'havartem. So it's a very unique word. You could also say, you don't even need the word at all. And perhaps that's how he's darshaning it, not from the word v'havartem specifically, but the fact that there is even a word here. No, it's not because they chose havartem instead of nitatem, but the fact that there's a word here. You could word it and say, if there's no sons, the daughter gets it, right? It's not like we pass it on to or something. You could have said it simpler in a way that just didn't even need a word, a verb like this. So yesh lecha havara acheret shehi kazo. So now they say the following: because there's this extra word, we're now going to say, well, how does the Yerusha go to the daughter? Well, as soon as the father dies, it's automatically in her hands, right? Snap of a finger, it's there. You don't have to do any act of acquiring. So what do they say? The extra word teaches you there's an additional case that's similar to this. Besides just when a daughter inherits or when a son inherits or when any of these people inherit, there's some, which it all is mentioned in the psukim. This extra word here is telling you there's an additional case where things move very easily from one to the other without any need for any act of acquiring. And ezo, what is this? We already know the answer. Matnat zo matnat shchib meira. That's the words of a shchib meira. Also, so just like their inheritance will automatically go to their children, if they say something on their deathbed, also goes automatically without any need for a kinyan. Rav Nachman amar Rabba baravua mehacha. So Rav Nachman doesn't agree with Rav. He brings a different pasuk in the name of Rabba baravua, a very similar kind of drasha. Unitatem et nachalato le'echad. Also, it says, right, when there's no son and there's no daughter, where does it go? It goes next to the brother. It doesn't really go to the father. Remember, that was the one that was missing in the psukim as a quick review of things we learned. But the pasuk says it'll then go to the brother. And again, it doesn't say the brother gets it or something like that. It says, and you will give it to the brother. So, yesh nitina acheret shikazo, that extra word nitina, it's not necessary. It's to teach you there's another nitina that happens in the same way. And also the brother gets it automatically. If there's no sons, there's no daughters, there's no father, the brother automatically gets it. You don't have to do any act of acquiring. So what else could be like this? There must be another case, and that's zomat not shchibra. So two psukim, very similar type of drasha. We're going to take a break for a minute and ask, why didn't each one hold like the other? Rav Nachman, my time alo amar mi v'ha'avaltem. I already kind of told you this. Because he needs that word for a different drasha, and you can't darshan two things from one word. Titanya, Rebbe Yomi, Bikula ne'emra behem nitina v'kan ne'emra havara. Right? This is what I told you already, what I reminded you. In all the cases, it says nitina unitatem and nachalato, unitatem and nachalato. But this one says, and you pass it on rather than you give it. So why did it use a special word here for the girl? Well, it's to teach you, for the daughters, ein lechashem avir nachalat mishevet l'shevet ela bat. It's to teach you that this is the only case where the nachala can actually leave, be passed over to a different tribe. Ho'il ubana uba'ala yorshimota, because if she marries someone else, what will happen? When she dies, and this is where we learn, the son or the husband can inherit. And that's what we learn from here, and therefore he couldn't use it for this pasuk. The Rabbi Zera, my time, alo amar mi unitatem. So now why did Rabbi Zera learn it from nitatem? Orche dekrahu, because that's just the regular way of saying it. Well, how else are you going to say it? Now, I did say you could sort of say it without that word, but you kind of need that word in there. You need a word in there. And therefore, he viewed it that the words are necessary. It's just, it should have been unitatem, unitatem. Why does it say vavatem by the girl? Because it wanted to teach you something additional. Those were the first two. Now we're going to move into the prophets. Rav Menashe bar Yirmiyah amar mehacha, bayamim ahem chalach Chizkiyahu lamut. Vayavo elav Yeshayahu ben Amot, so Chizkiyahu gets sick and he's going to die. He doesn't end up dying, but he is going to, looks like he's going to die then. And Yeshayahu comes and tells him, Vayavo elav Yeshayahu ben Amot hanavi, vayomer elav, and he says to him, Ko amar Hashem, this is what God said you should do since you're going to die. Sav lebetecha ki met ata velo techyeh. Go command your household. Command meaning, sav, by the way, the Hebrew word for will is tziva'ah, from the lashon of command. Say, sav is to give a command in words. Say what you want to do with all your possessions, because you're going to die, velo techyeh, you're not going to survive. What do you see here? B'tzava'ah ba'alma. Now, this, not that we necessarily can derive halachot from the prophets, that the prophets are teaching us a halacha, but it's indicative of what was before. If that's the way people did it, then what you see here is the way people did it. If the way people did it, that must be, it's effective by Torah law. So, Sav ba'alma, and we're going to do the same with the next source. Rami bar Yechezkel Amar Mehachi brings a different source. Achitophel. Achitophel was the advisor of David HaMelech, and then he switches sides and goes to Avshalom, and Avshalom rebels, and then Avshalom ends up not taking his advice. He takes someone else's advice. If you want to read more about it and you want to learn even more in depth about the whole thing, you can read a flashback this week of Shuli Mishkin, which goes through the whole story and also adds some more insights and some historical points. Achitophel ra'a ki lo ne'asat tzatto. Now, what he realizes is Avshalom doesn't take his advice, and then also Avshalom ends up, his rebellion is quelled, and what happens is David is now going to be back in charge, and Achitophel realizes this is the end of my life. So, right, I'm definitely going to get killed now for being a traitor. So what does he do? He gets his donkey ready. He goes back home to his house, to his city. Vayetzav el beito, he makes a tzava'ah, a will for his family, and you think it's because he thinks he's going to die, but no. Because he thinks he's going to be killed, he says, better I commit suicide, vayechanek, and he strangles himself and commits suicide, and what he does is, vayetzav el beito first. And again, what do you see here? The language of tzav, commanding in words what to do with my possessions. Okay, now we could have ended here, but the Gemara wants to get into, and I leave it for you to think about, why this whole sugya is here. Okay, now remember, Achitophel was an advisor, and he has advice for his children before he dies. And from here, we're going to get off on a total tangent. And what he does is, and this is, I think, maybe there's this idea of when you die, it's not just leaving over your possessions, but it's leaving over your wishes, what you want your kids to do when you die, what you want them to learn from the lessons, the mistakes that you made in your life. And that's what we have with Achitophel here. So the first two are going to be pretty obvious. The last one's going to be a little strange, and that's the one we're going to go off on, and we're going to get off on a total tangent. And that's a tangent that I'm not really sure, I haven't figured out yet, if there's some connection to the content there to what we're learning, but I leave it to you to think about. So the Braita says, Tanu Rabbanan, Shloshat dvarim tzivah Achitophel lepanav. There were three things he commanded his sons upon his death. Al tiyu b'machloket, don't get involved in a machloket, okay, because what did he do, right? That brought to his downfall. He got involved between this machloket, between Avshalom and his father. V'al timrdu b'machupei David. And besides, don't get involved in general in machlokot, in debate, fights between people, but also, right, don't rebel against the kingdom of David, because I made a huge mistake in my life by doing that. And here's the third one that seems like a totally disconnected one. Yom Tov shel Atzeret barul zir'u chitim. If you see that the Yom Tov of Atzeret, which is Shavuot, is a clear day, you should know that year you should plant a lot of chitim, of wheat. It's a sign that it's going to be a very good year. Okay, now we're going to talk about signs of good things to come and bad things to come and all sorts of signs that if this happens, this is a sign. But first we have to understand the sign. There were different opinions about this sign. Mar Zutra Amar Balul Itmar says it wasn't barul, clear, it was balul. If you see it's a cloudy day, you should plant grains. You should plant wheat. It'll be a good year. Amar Nahardia Mishmei Rabbi Yaakov lo barul mamash v'lo balul mamash. He says it's actually a combination of the two. It doesn't mean a totally clear day, or it doesn't have to be a totally clear day. A totally clear day would be a good sign. And when it says cloudy, it doesn't mean totally cloudy. The way you can understand it is ela afilu balul, even if it's cloudy. In other words, a really clear day would be a good sign. Even if it's cloudy, as long as the ruach tzfonit min hashavto, but the north wind is coming and blowing the clouds to the sides, basically allowing sun to come through, zehu barur. That's enough to call it a clear day. Okay? Partly cloudy, basically, you would call it, with a north wind coming. From here, the Gemara is going to get all off on the winds and all that. So, Amar Rabbi Abba Rav Ashi Anan Ad Rav Yitzchak Bar Avdimi Matnin Alau. We actually taught this on what Rav Yitzchak Bar Avdimi said. To Amar Rav Yitzchak Bar Avdimi, Motzei Yom Tov Acharon Shel Chag, Hakot Sofim LaAshana Maracha. Okay, we had a different way of learning this. Rav Yitzchak Bar Avdimi said, on the last day of Sukkot, okay, not Shavuot, but the last day of Sukkot, which, by the way, are somewhat parallel, because Atzeret is called also Shmini Atzeret, and Atzeret, Shavuot, is like the end of Pesach, because of the 7 weeks of the Omer. And the last day of Chag is, right, the Shmini Atzeret. It's like the 8th day. Stands also separate. So anyway, everybody looks at the Ashan that's coming out, the smoke that's coming out from the temple, from the Maracha, from where the sacrifices were. And they use it as a sign of what the year is going to be. Now, why the smoke? Because the way the smoke is moving is an indicator of where the wind is coming from. So if the smoke is moving to the south, it means there's a north wind. If the smoke is moving to the north, it means that there's a south wind, etc. So now we're going to go through, and there's a chart on your page which kind of charts this out, not in the words of the Bright exactly of Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Avdimi, but you'll see. Tried to simplify it, not because we're going to see the way what he says is going to be contradicted by a Bright. So if the smoke is going toward the north, which means the south wind, the poor people are very happy. The balabayits, the ones who own land, the landowners, are sad. Why? The south wind is a sign of a lot of rain this year. And why is that not good? Well, even though a lot will grow, they won't be able to store them for the long term. They'll have to get rid of them quickly. Which means because if there's so much rain, it'll rot in their storehouses. They didn't have good refrigeration or anything like that. And the perot markivim, the fruit will rot. So they have to get rid of it quickly, which always makes the prices drop. So while they'll have a lot of produce, they're going to have to get rid of it quickly and sell it for cheap. Natak klape darom. If the smoke is turning toward the south, which means the north wind, aniyim atzebim ubale batim smechim, the exact opposite. The aniyim are not happy, and the bale batim are very happy because the amount of rain will be not a lot. It won't be too little. They'll have produce. It just won't be a huge amount of produce, but they can store their stuff. And then they can release it a little bit at a time, and they can sell it for high prices because the supply will be low. If it's toward the east, which means the west wind, everybody's happy because it's the perfect amount of rain. It's not too much, not too little, enough grows. It's not too wet that they can't store anything, but they're not going to store everything. It's like an in-between. It makes everybody happy. But if it's the east wind and the smoke is going toward the west, that's a very bad sign. It means it's going to be heat, dry, no rain. That's never good for anybody. Now the Gemara says, okay, and that's basically a different version of what they said in the name of Achitofel. Now we're going to say, wait, there's a contradiction because in a different Braita, if you go to these winds in which direction and what it's a sign of, Mizrachit la'olam yafa, the east wind is always good. Now we just said the east wind is the worst. It brings heat and dries out everything. So here it says it's the best. And Maravi la'olam kashan, the one that we said was perfect, here it's the opposite. It's the worst. Ruach tzfonit, this doesn't contradict, but this is just about the ruach tzfonit and the ruach dromit. Well, it a little bit contradicts because it says, the north wind is good for the grain, the wheat. Once it grows to a third, like if it comes, that north wind at that point, it's very good. Once the olives bring out the flowers, once they flower, then it's actually, the north wind is bad for it. And the ruach dromit is the exact opposite. Ruach dromit once it grew to a third of its growth, then already the south wind is going to be bad for it, and it's yafel zeitim b'sha'ash yanitzu, and it's good for the olives when they bud. Amar Rav Yosef, just a side point about the ruach tzfonit and the ruach dromit, and then we're going to go back to the contradiction about the east and the west winds. Amar Rav Yosef, v'yitem Amar Zutra, v'yitem Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. How do you remember the south and the north? Which is good for which is good for wheat, and which is good for the olives? Well, simanech shulchan b'tzafonu menorah b'darom. Now, if you can remember, you have to remember this, but the assumption was everyone knew this. Where is the shulchan situated in the heichal, and where is the menorah? The shulchan is in the north, the menorah is in the south. Hai merabi didei v'hai merabi didei. Now, let's talk about each one is good for what it needs. What is a shulchan? Well, it's not just a table. It's the table that held the bread, the lechem hapanim. The lechem hapanim came from the wheat. So the shulchan is in the north, which means the north wind is good for the bread. And the menorah, this is just cute, right? The menorah is in the south. You need oil for the menorah, and that's the olives. So it's good for the olives is the south. Okay, but now we get to the contradiction, and we say, actually, lo kasha. This is really not a contradiction. Why is that? Halan v'halahu. It's a difference between Israel and Babylonia, and we know that the climate was very different. And in Babylonia, they had a lot of rain. And therefore, when you look back at the Braita is lan, that's lanu, that's for us. There, the Mizrachit is actually good because we need some dry. We have a lot of rain and we need to dry out that rain. So the wind that comes from the east that dries things out is actually good for us. Whereas in Israel, lehu, for them, the dryness we know is terrible. If you don't get a lot of rain, it's not a good thing. Okay, now we're still not done with this tangent. We have a few more things that people talk about, signs for what's going to be. Tanya Abba Shaul Omer, there's another Braita that says, Abba Shaul says, Yom Tov Shel Atzeret Barur Siman Yafeh Lekol HaShana Kula. Okay, and this is similar to what they said in the name of Achitofel, that on Atzeret, the Yom Tov of Atzeret, on Shavuot, that day is a sign of what the year is going to be. You have to remember, that's the day that they brought the Shtei HaLechem sacrifice. Okay, if we remember, the Korban HaOmer permits people to eat from the new grains of the previous year that now has grown, the new crop, you can eat from it starting from the day after the first day of Pesach on the Omer, when the Omer sacrifice is brought. But in the temple, they wouldn't bring from the new crop until Shavuot. So that's what the Shtei HaLechem does. It permits bringing the Shtei HaLechem was one of the few things that brought chametz in the temple, and it was brought with the new crop of grain. And it was to basically permit bringing the new grains into the temple, okay, using the grains from the new crop. So that's why it was kind of a sign for the next year's crop, because that was when we kind of start using the new crop and then also start planting for the next season. Amar Rav Zvid, Ha Yom Kama Derei Shata. Rav Zvid has a different approach. He says it's the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Okay, it's not the end of Sukkot, which was also when we pray for rain and all that. It's not Shavuot when we bring the Shtei HaLechem and kind of permit the new crop and then start thinking about the next year. But it's Rosh Hashanah, right? I don't know if you grew up on this, but I always grew up on don't sleep Rosh Hashanah, because if you sleep on Rosh Hashanah, you'll sleep the whole year. And I see a lot of nodding here. So this is very similar. It's a little bit different, but what he says is like this. I chamim kula shata chamima. I karir kula shata karira. The weather on Rosh Hashanah, forget about sleeping. The weather on Rosh Hashanah is indicative of what the weather will be like for the rest of the year. If it's a hot day, it will be hot for the rest of the year. If it's a cold day, it will be cold for the rest of the year. And the Mai Nafkamina, so what's the relevance of this? Turning now to Amabet. Interesting Nafkamina. Okay, now, before we even get to the Nafkamina, if you didn't look ahead yet, until now, what's the real Nafkamina? Well, it's what Achitofel told his sons. If you see this sign it's going to be a good year, then plant a lot of wheat. If you see it's going to be a bad year, don't waste your seeds and plant them if nothing's going to grow. So it has a lot of ramifications for agriculture. So now they say, well, if you look at Rosh Hashanah and you see what the year is going to be like, it's going to affect what? Litfilato shel Kohen Gadol. It's going to affect the Kohen Gadol's prayer on Yom Kippur. Remember, the Kohen Gadol prays. It should be a year of blessing. It should be a year of this. It should be a year of that. So he needs to know, right? In those days, it wasn't like we had a set prayer. Now we just read whatever it says in the Machzor. In those days, the Kohen Gadol would say his own prayer. So the Tosafot says it nicely. He says, if it's going to be a hot year, so he prays it's not too hot. If it's going to be a cold year, he prays it won't be too cold. Okay, right? Everything in moderation. And you have to know what to pray for. So you use Rosh Hashanah as your marker for Yom Kippur prayers. Okay, that was all a total tangent, which again, I want you to spend some time maybe thinking. I'm not sure if you'll get somewhere. I didn't get anywhere yet in my thinking about what the connection of all these signs about the weather is to all of our things about the Shchib I mean, again, maybe, well, I'm trying to think now, but Shchib it's all about planning, right? Planning for the future. Maybe this is also planning for the future, seeing signs and using them as indicators for what the future is going to be. Whereas, the Shchib is sort of planning. That's what they're doing. They're planning for the future, thinking about their children and their futures and all that. Anyway, so still needs a little bit of work. Now we get to our fifth. So we had, I see you're saying Achitofel's instructions. It's obvious, right? That Achitofel's instructions connect this, but again, why are his instructions having to do with this is a siman for, whether it'll be a good year or not? But again, it's leaving his legacy to his children, I guess, and what are important things to be focusing on in life. Okay, we had 4 explanations. How do we know Shchimera from the Torah? 2 psukim in the Torah, havartem unitatem. 2 psukim, and again, this is all different rabbis giving different opinions. 2, either to learn from Achitofel or from Chizkiyahu, which both are really the same kind of proof. Each of them were either told or did. Tzav, command to your household, what you want to do with your possessions. Here comes the 5th, which I said is a standalone, and perhaps the break could also claim they got off on a tangent, perhaps to make a really clear separation between this and the previous ones, because we have a very different approach here. Rava Amarav Nachman manat shchimera miderabanan ba'almahi. It's just a Rabbanit. It's not from the Torah. Really, from the Torah, divrei shchimera needs a kinyan. You can't just say, I want this to go and that'll work. But why did the rabbis institute this? The rabbis institute this, and you should know this by now already because we've talked about it. Shema titaref da'ato alav. And here's where it comes up in the Gemara. It didn't come up before, but this is where we've mentioned it many times because the commentaries always go back to this, which is we're worried that the rabbis didn't want to upset a person on their deathbed. And we're worried that they'll get all worked up, that I didn't do things properly, right? You can imagine you're at the end of your life. You feel like I didn't finish everything. I didn't do all the things I wanted to accomplish, and particularly who I want to divide up my possessions to. So we try to make it easy to keep them calmer, right? Perhaps even save their life, right? Because if they're leaning toward death, we already discussed that there was always this concern, there was a concern, a good concern that maybe they'll survive. And if we get them more worked up, they'll definitely, more likely they're going to die. And therefore we want to keep them calm, or we just want to at least make it pleasant for them the last moments of their life. That's Rava in the name of Rav Nachman. Now the Gemara is going to ask, and they're going to quote a very interesting sugya, which is a difficult sugya. We've actually seen it many times. If you look in the Masoret Hashas, which is that little note on the side, by me it's an aleph, which sends you one of the alephs. There's 3 alephs here, but one of them sends you to all the places in Shas where the sugya appears. It says Bava Kama Pei Tep, Bava Metzia Daf Kaf, Ktubo Pei Hey, Pei Vav, Kiddushin Mem Chet. Okay, we've already seen the sugya a lot. Gefet this week of Rabbanit Yael Shimoni is on this topic. Very fascinating shiur. It should go up later today. This is a really, really tough case to swallow. And the more, if you want to really learn in depth about it and have some unique understandings of it, I recommend you listen to her shiur. So now we ask the following question. Mi amar Rav Nachman hachi. This is the classic thing the Gemara does. Takes a statement of Rav Nachman and says, but this doesn't jive with some other statement that you made. Ha amar Rav Nachman, didn't he say? And now, before we get to Rav Nachman, we're going to quote, he quotes Shmuel, and then he has something to comment about Shmuel's halacha. Shmuel's halacha is the real main halacha that's troublesome. Af agav da'amar Shmuel, even though Shmuel said, and then we're going to get to the end, okay? We're going to say, even though he said this, he'll be moda in a different case. That he'll admit that in a different case, it won't be true. But let's see first what Shmuel says. Hamocher shtar chov l'chavecho. People in general, we learned this many times, sell promissory notes. So let's go back to our Ruth Naomi example. Ruth loans Naomi money. So Naomi owes Ruth money right now. Naomi owes Ruth $100,000. Let's give a big amount. So you'll see how crazy this halacha is. So Naomi owes Ruth $100,000. Ruth has a document that says Naomi owes her money. Ruth needs the money now, and the loan isn't up for another year or 2. So Ruth goes to David, and she says to David, I want to sell you my shtar chov, and I want you to pay me the money for it. Now, David's probably not going to pay $100,000 for it because you never know if Naomi will actually pay the money back. It's a bit of a risk. So he'll pay her some amount, whether, $75,000, I don't know, whatever amount he'll pay her. He'll pay her something for the promissory note, and it becomes his. And he can collect it for the $100,000. So hopefully he'll gain money on it, right? He's willing to pay less in the hopes that he'll get more, but knowing that there's a bit of a risk involved. Now, what's the main risk? The main risk is that Naomi won't pay the loan back and won't have the money to pay back. But comes Shmuel and adds another huge risk to this because he says, if Ruth sells her shtar chov to David, v'chazar umachalo, and then A year later, when the loan's coming up to be collected, Naomi goes to Ruth and says, listen, I'm really desperate. I don't have the money. Can you just cancel the loan? Now, Ruth, what does she care to cancel the loan, right? In other words, it's not between her and Naomi anymore. But the IOU is still in Ruth's name because David has a document that said that Naomi owes Ruth money. So according to Shmuel, if Chazaru Machalo, and Ruth says, you know what, I'll be nice to you. You don't have to pay me back. Machul. She can do that. It's effective. Poor David. He really loses out here. Now the Rashbam points out, don't worry. He obviously can go back to Ruth and say, you owe me money. And this is based on, the Rashbam says, Dina Degarmi. If you remember, Dina Degarmi, it's an indirect way of causing someone a loss. But remember, there's Grama, there's Garmi. Garmi, most people think is a more severe, where it's much more clear that it's indirect, but very direct, indirect. And obviously, and one of the things Rabbanit discusses in her Shiur is that there's a distinction, there's a machlok in it, exactly what he has to pay back, what Ruth has to pay him, the $75,000 for what he bought it for, or the $100,000 that it's worth. What kind of a loss is interesting? That's an interesting machloket. Anyway, without getting into all the details, the fact is it's effective. Okay, whether or not she has to pay, that's a whole different story. But it is effective mechila because the document is still in her name. And afilu yoresh mochel. And not only that, but if Ruth dies, and now she's not even around anymore, her heirs can now cancel the loan if they wanted. Okay? Even they can do that because it's really in their name at this point, even though, again, they're not really relevant here anymore because it was sold to David. That's the case. Now, that's what Rav Nachman quotes. But remember, he started it with, even though Shmuel says this, Modeh Shmuel she'im nitano b'matnat shchimera de'eno yachol lemochlo. Well, Shmuel admits that if the person, like Ruth here in the story, didn't sell it, but gave it as a gift on her deathbed, then the heirs cannot cancel the loan. Now, this is a very interesting thing, because what we're saying is, and this is why this raises a question against Rav Nachman, because if you say that the words of a shchimera are so strong, then what is it? Then you understand they're derived, they're by Torah law. Then you could fathom this distinction. If Ruth sells it, now selling obviously has validity on a Torah level. It's a sale, right? And a sale has rules according to Torah. You do a kinyan, an act of acquiring, right? So David acquired this fair and square according to Torah law, and yet Ruth can still cancel it. But if she passes it on as a matnat shchimera to David, then she can't cancel. Then her heirs can't cancel it anymore. That shows that a matnat shchimera is actually stronger than a sale. Now, if a matnat shchimera is only derabbanan, how could it possibly work that way? So again, right? If you say it's by Torah law, the words of a shchimera are as if they're ksuvim usurim. So if Ruth said, I'm passing this promissory note on to David, then there's nothing you could do about it. Mishum hachi eno yecholim chol. That's how we could explain that the heirs can't cancel it anymore. But if you say it's rabbinic, why? Right? It's only rabbinic. The strength of this kinyan of the shchimera to David is weak. It's only rabbinic. It's a takana, just so that she doesn't go crazy on her deathbed. But how could you possibly say that it has more strength than a sale? To which the Gemara answers something really interesting, which is Eina shel Torah v'asa'ua keshel Torah. If you notice, there's a gimel here, which means that gimel sends you to the Torah, the Mishpat Ner Mitzvah, which shows you the halacha, which means we paskin this way, and that's why they're always quoting this Shemati Taref Da To'alav, because we really hold that it's rabbinic. But the rabbis, and here's something really interesting, they gave strength to their takana as if it was by Torah law. So that means that this is a very strong thing here. It means that when a shchimera says, I'm giving my possessions to so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, it's a done deal and it has significance as if it was a Torah law. And that's why Rav Nachman could say what he says about Shmuel's halacha, that Shmuel would admit, though, that the heirs can't cancel it if it was given as a shchimera gift, whereas even though it's only rabbinic. Okay? So that's Rav Nachman. So that was our fifth answer to what the source for shchimera is, and it's not from the Torah according to this, it's rabbinic, but as strength of Torah law. Now we're going to move on to another statement that Rava said in the name of Rav Nachman about a shchim meirah, but something else entirely. Amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman. Shchim meirah she'amar, we're just going to get started on this today. We'll continue this tomorrow. Shchim meirah she'amar, yadur ploni bebayit zeh. So-and-so will live in my house. Now that's an action. That's not passing over property. It's not saying I'm giving you my house to live in. It's saying this person can live in my house. Now, to live in someone's house, that's not something tangible. It's not giving someone something. Or yochal ploni, it's called in Hebrew, ein bo mamash. Doesn't have anything real in it. It's not tangible. Yochal ploni perot yekel zeh. Or this person will eat the fruits of my tree. Which again, eating the fruits of a tree, first of all, it's not so tangible. And it's got another problem, which is the fruits of the tree aren't even here yet. They're, right? Lo amar klum. So if you say any of these things on your deathbed, this is not valid. Ad shiomal, you have to say, shnu bayit zeh leploni v'yadorbo. You have to give the person something tangible. Give this person my house in order to live in. Shnu dekel zeh leploni. Give this tree to someone. V'yochal perotav, and they'll eat the fruits of that tree. That will work. So you have to be particular in your language. So even though we're saying shamati tereif da'ato'ala, well, we only make you say it, but you have to say it in a way that you're actually giving them something tangible and something that's in existence. It has to be both tangible and in existence right now, not like fruits that are not yet in existence. Obviously, there are fruits that are in existence, but if you're saying whatever fruits this tree bears, that's not something that's in existence. But again, if I give you the tree for its fruits, that can work. So now the Gemara says, again, we're going to ask a question, but we won't really fully understand the question yet until tomorrow. L'meimra de savar Rav Nachman miltidita babari ita b'shchid meirah, deleta babari leta b'shchid meirah. Now, when you give a gift, in regular cases, you're a bari, you're healthy, and you give a gift. So again, we talked about this many times. When you do a kinyan, it has to be on something sheyesh bo mamash. It has to be on something tangible, and it has to be something that's in existence. Ein adam makneh davar shelo ba la'olam. Right? There's Rabbi Meir who thinks you can, but most opinions think you can't. So basically, this sounds like Rav Nachman saying that whatever is true for a matnat bari is also true for a matnat shchid meirah, a regular gift, right? The rules that apply to regular gift giving are the same rules that apply for a shchid meirah. And the rules, right? So what they're saying here is the ita b'bari, whatever rules exist for a bari, exists for a shchid meirah. And delay to b'bari, if you don't need it in a bari, meaning this is good enough for a bari, it's good enough for a shchid meirah, right? Whatever's true for there is true for there. Rav Nachman, we'll stop mid-sentence as the daf stops there, but doesn't Rava say in Rav Nachman something that seems to contradict this? So that will be our question for tomorrow. Quick review of our daf. Pretty simple daf to review because we started with we had this one source that we tried to say, is it only Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh? And then kind of said, no, we could fit that in with the rabbis because it was a different kind of case than all the other umdana cases because it was pretty clear cut. And we had to say, well, then what were you thinking in the first place? Then we got to our basic sugya for the covered almost all of today's stuff, which was other than the tangent, which was what are the sources for the fact that a divrei shchid meirah are kechtuvim uchimesurim dami. Okay, what are our sources for that? Two from the Torah, two from the prophets. Since we mentioned Achitophel, we got off on three things he advised his children upon his death. And from there we got into, which again is not in the Torah, not in the prophets, by the way. It's not in Sefer Shmuel. It's right. It's the rabbis saying this is what he must have told his children on his death, or some masoret, some tradition about it. From there, since the third one had to do with signs about the weather and what it's an indicator of, we got into all different kinds of sources about what's a sign for what. We had some contradictions with which winds are good, which winds are bad. We distinguished Israel and Babylonia, and we saw the ramifications of why we need to know what, right, either for planting or for the Tefillah of the Kohen Gadol, and that was the one that talked about Rosh Hashanah as a sign. Right, we have Rosh Hashanah as a sign. We had the last day of Sukkot as a sign, and we had the last day, the day of Shavuot as a sign. Then we got to our fifth answer, which is it's not actually by Torah law, it's actually rabbinic. And then we said, how could you say it's rabbinic based on what you said about Shmuel, about this mocher shtar chov? And then we said, it's rabbinic, but the rabbis gave it a lot of strength. Okay, they gave it the power, the effectiveness of a Torah law kinyan, as if there was a Torah law acquisition, even though there wasn't. And then we started with this last halach of another halach Rava quotes in the Rav Nachman about shchid meirah has to pass on possessions in a way that's effective and seemingly the same way it would be effective in a regular sale, where there's certain criteria, like, and it's, again, it doesn't have to be written down or passed with a kinyan, but you need certain criteria. It has to be something that has substance to it, an actual object, not an action, like live in my house, but here's my house to live in. And it has to be something that's in existence, like the tree that's in existence and not the fruits on the tree, right? So if you're giving just the rights to the fruits, that's not something that you can pass over as a manat chimera, to which we're going to have a question on that, which we'll get to tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good day and shema b'sarot tovot.